Good morning. Heading back out to do some more training this morning. Had a good day yesterday with the recruits. Day one of firearms with them, which is always an interesting thing to start introducing recruits to the ideas and kind of the principles behind why we train, specifically train for deadly encounters. And that kind of got me thinking about just generally about deadly police use of force and some of the controversy around that. In the classroom portion of that day one class, we go over a lot of the statistics about officer fatalities and officer shootings. It's interesting stuff that not a lot of people know. For example, the vast majority of gunfights involving police officers occur at close range, like 10 feet and in. I think more than half of them were 5 to 0 feet, so like arm's length, like really close. 70 to 80% of the time it's subdued lighting or in darkness. And then 40% of the time, so almost half of the time, there's multiple assailants in a gunfight. Now, when you look at like a website like Officer Down Memorial Page or odmp.org, they track really closely the number of officer fatalities every year, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 100, 120, something like that a year. And you've got, depending on how you count them, between 250,000 and 500,000 officers nationwide, like sworn officers doing like actual patrol stuff. So that the fatality rate is quite low. And then when you break down the fatality rate, I mean, controlling for things like COVID, it was, exceptionally high the last couple of years, and there's reasons for that. But typically somewhere around half of those 100, 120 fatalities are felonious assault, or somebody deliberately killed the officer. And traditionally, 5-10 years ago, it was vehicle crashes were kind of the lion's share of those fatalities. But the felonious assault category has been creeping up over time. And so that begs the question, right? Is the job becoming more dangerous? How dangerous is the job actually? You hear things floating around like, well, I mean, the death rate for officers is not even in like the top 10 or whatever, most deadly occupations, and I think it's like loggers is number one, or like oil rig workers, offshore oil rig workers. So therefore, being a police officer is not dangerous, right? Which is kind of a silly thing to say. Like, dangerous and deadly aren't necessarily the same thing. Certainly there's a correlation there, right? If lots of people are dying, it's certainly dangerous. But you don't have to die for something to be dangerous, to harm you in some way, right? And harms are different. I saw on the news recently there's a federal lawsuit going on in Portland about riot control measures that were used in the summer of 2020, and there's activists and people speaking publicly about how traumatized they were by being exposed to things like tear gas, which is fine. I'm not saying it's fine that they're traumatized. I mean, it's fine that that's how they've interpreted that experience and how they feel about it. Like, I'm not going to, question or challenge that. They're saying they've been traumatized and now they feel hypervigilant and unsafe all the time because they had this experience, maybe, a number of times during the ongoing protests or riots or both. I'm not going to question that. But how many rioters and protesters died in the summer of 2020? So, and I don't think it's fair to say that was not a highly dangerous situation for the protesters, as well as for the officers working the protests. There was a lot of violent conflict going on. A lot of people got hurt. And yes, some people died. I mean, depending on the sources you look at, somewhere around 20-25 people died as a direct or indirect result of the ongoing riots that happened in the summer of 2020. Now, in a country of 320 million-ish people, that's, kind of a drop in the bucket, but I don't think any of those activists would say that it's an insignificant number of people that died, even though they maybe don't want to talk about the circumstances bringing around those deaths, because it wasn't officers causing those deaths. It was other people associated with those violent incidents. Maybe we'll call them rioters. Or you look at something else like military. How many people died in Afghanistan in the last 5 years? I don't know off the top of my head, but we're hearing about massive body counts in the ongoing, nearly endless conflicts in the Middle East. Nobody sane would try to argue that because the body counts are not high, being in the military is not a highly dangerous occupation. That's stupid. And so people who want to make that point about law enforcement not being dangerous because lots of cops don't die has an axe to grind. They have an agenda, and they want to downplay the very real dangers that officers face every day. I doubt, and granted, I'm not a logger, but I doubt that there's a whole lot of inner turmoil and ongoing trauma that occurs because friends and family members of loggers are worried about their loved ones dying on the job, even though they die at a significantly higher rate. Which isn't to say they're not worried about occupational safety stuff. I'm sure they're very worried about it, but what I'm saying is it's different, right? You don't walk through the woods wondering if a tree is going to jump out and have a sudden violent assault against you. It's different. If you look at the FBI Uniform Crime Report, they track the number of assaults on officers, the number of injuries incurred in those assaults, the types of weapons and assailants used against those officers. Now, granted, it doesn't capture all law enforcement agencies in the country. It's about 66% of them, although those tend to be the largest agencies. So it really accounts for far and away most of the police officers in the country, right? And somewhere around 50,000, 45,000 assaults against officers occur annually. And so that's, 100 or more a day across the country, just assaults. And then, again, somewhere in the neighborhood to 10 to 15,000 of those assaults include a deadly or dangerous weapon. And then of those, on average, around more than 10,000 of those deadly weapons assaults result in injuries being incurred by officers, right? So, again, 365 days in a year, there's, dozens to, 100 or more, happening. I haven't done the math recently, so I don't know what the average per day is, but, you got your calculator, whip it out. You have 13,000 divided by 365. Now, again, you got to average that across a population of maybe 500,000, 750,000, maybe. Again, it depends on how you count them, who you qualify. And does that include, the police lieutenant who sits at a desk all day, or is that just, actual people working patrol functions, right? We have as a culture this tendency to look at fatalities caused by officers specifically really, really closely, which is fine. Officers have an enormous amount of power and authority that they're vested with to make split-second decisions in rapidly evolving dynamic situations, right? So they kind of have to have some of that discretion, but it still deserves a proportionate amount of scrutiny, right? And so somewhere in the neighborhood, again, depending on who's keeping count, of 1,000 or so people die as a result of some sort of enforcement action every year. And each of those gets scrutinized far more intensely than, say, the 250,000 or 250,000 people that die as a result of medical errors or negligence on the part of doctors. So nobody's protesting outside of doctors' houses. Nobody's trying to burn down hospitals. Nobody's chanting, defund the medical system because doctors are, inadvertently through, negligence or just plain errors, killing 250,000 Americans every year. All right, everybody understands that people are going to the doctors for help. The doctors are trying to do some sort of intervention. They see a lot of people, and they're human beings, right? Now, is that an acceptable number of errors? I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I don't know how you control for what an acceptable level of error, medical errors leading to death is. And I don't know who's even tracking that information. Are they self-reporting? I don't know. That's the statistics I've seen. Feel free to fact check me on that. But it's significantly higher than the number of people being killed by officers, right? And in discussions with people, I've asked, and people don't think this way, and I understand why, but like, what is an appropriate number of people to be shot by the police? When I've asked that, you get something like the reaction of, oh God, how awful to even consider having to control for that sort of variable, right? To even try and put a number on it, because we don't want anybody to be killed by the police, right? I get that, right? That's reasonable. I don't want anybody to die. And I certainly don't want to be in a position to kill anybody. I don't think any reasonable officer would. Anybody who wants to be in a position to kill somebody is sick in some way and needs to not be a police officer. But that said, we know that it's going to happen, right? In some respect. I mean, even in the most placid, Western democracy where there are, no guns owned by the public, and officers walk around with no firearms, there are still some number of fatalities that occur every year at the hands of police. Now, people want to point to those places and say, well, why can't we be like that? And there's certainly a discussion to be had about why. But if from our armchairs we're just going to kind of roughly estimate a reasonable number, you got to think of what circumstances is it reasonable for an officer to use deadly force to protect himself or protect others, right? So under what circumstances do you think that's okay? And even in the most hardened, ACAB crowd people that I know and I've talked to, and I show them a video of an unprovoked violent attack by someone against a police officer who's, mag dumping, just firing, a dozen rounds in the span of a second or two at an officer, even then, that person who's very anti-police is like, well, yes, I believe it would be reasonable for the officer to return fire. Okay, great. There's your line. How often does that happen? And if you don't know the answer to that question, how often does something happen to a police officer that you think it's acceptable for him to use deadly force to protect himself or another? If you don't know how often that happens, then you can't say that police kill too many people. Now, you can look at a specific situation and say, hey, this seems bogus to me. Fine. We can talk about that on a case-by-case basis. But let's not conflate statistical meta-level information versus specific granular examples, right? If you want to go case by case, we can talk about all of the, totality of the circumstances that led up to whatever decision being made and what the relevant case law is, and whether or not those actions were objectively reasonable or not. And sometimes they're not. And nobody sane is going to protect all police use of force at all times because, again, cops are human beings. They're going to make mistakes, and bad things are going to happen. And, heaven forbid, I'm that guy making that mistake on that day. I do everything I can to prevent that from happening, but, shit, I'm human. Who knows, right? But again, so if you don't know how often that happens, then you can't say at a meta statistical level whether or not it's happening too much, right? And so if you look at that FBI data and you know that 13,000 or so times in a year, officers are assaulted with a weapon capable of causing serious physical injury or death, then you might infer that it might be reasonable somewhere around that often for officers to use deadly force to protect themselves, right? If officers are incurring injuries based on deadly weapon assaults that often, then they probably are going to be that often in a position to return fire and kill someone, right? But cops only, again, kill maybe around 1,000 people a year. At least 1,000 people a year die in some sort of enforcement-related activity, and that's not specifically just cops shooting people or, leaning on their neck or whatever, other ugly thing has happened, right? So, it just, again, if we do the rough math, if somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 deadly weapon assaults resulting in injuries happen to officers a year, and only about 1,000 people die in enforcement-related activity, then roughly about 10% of the time, officers are using deadly force to protect themselves and killing somebody in the process, right? Which isn't to say they don't use deadly force more often and it doesn't kill somebody, but there's this notion that cops are trigger happy, they're out hunting people, especially people of color, looking for opportunities to use deadly force and are eager to do so. Those people might exist. I don't know any of those people. If I do know those people, I'm going to try and get them out of this career because they don't belong here. I don't want them here. But that said, I'm not everywhere, right? My experience is limited to my, narrow slice of the world. But I won't deny that those people might exist somewhere, right? But that said, if we're looking at meta level data, right, statistical level data, if they're only killing people roughly about 10% of the time that maybe it might be reasonable to do so, then that to me indicates an enormous level of restraint, not trigger happiness, right? Not some sort of bloodlust for, getting involved in violent encounters, but restraint, right? And going back to this notion that the job is not dangerous, right? How many people who are bloggers or cab drivers or bartenders or whatever other dangerous occupations where people work have stories about friends who have been and coworkers and who have been shot, stabbed, bludgeoned, had body parts bitten off. How many funerals have they been to for fellow professionals who died in the line of duty, right? Now, law enforcement has some tradition and ritual around how we do line of duty deaths, and maybe they get a little more attention in some respects than other folks. So again, I'm not going to say those things don't happen, but again, you talk about trauma, right? And stress and trauma is cumulative. And if it's reasonable for somebody who is exposed to tear gas 1 or half a dozen times or more at a protest to feel, again, unsafe, hypervigilant, traumatized, how much more so over a 20, 30-year career of having those experiences happen to you, being assaulted, having friends, maimed, injured, and killed in the line of duty, how much cumulative trauma is that going to include, right? And is it really reasonable to say that law enforcement's not that dangerous? I call bullshit. It's dangerous. Extremely so. And the only reason that the felonious deaths are so low is because things like gunshot wounds in the United States have a survival rate in like the 80% range, right? And that goes for suspects and officers, right? If you get shot, you're more likely than not going to survive. And I know people who've been shot, more than a dozen times and survived. I know somebody who took a load of birdshot to the face, had his aorta ruptured, or not his aorta, his carotid artery ruptured, has lead pellets lodged in his brain, had to have his vocal cords reconstructed, still survived, still with us. Now, how long those people have left on this earth, and what sort of quality of life they're going to have following that kind of trauma, I mean, who's to say? Well, only time will tell. Yeah, that trauma is cumulative, right? And so unless you've lived that, and we talk a lot in this culture about lived experience, and we sure are eager to hear the lived experience of people who are on the other side of the protest line, so to speak, and how traumatized they are and how unsafe they feel because of the things officers do. But no time or attention gets taken to actually look at the lived experience of officers. I mean, really what it's like. And, I mentioned before, you can't really know what it's like unless you've been there. And so people who don't do this are just gonna kind of have to, A, look at the data, and there's data out there, and B, use your imagination a little bit. Try to put yourself in those shoes. Ask yourself if that's something you could do. Kissing your loved ones on the way out the door every day. Unsure if today is the day that somebody's going to try and shoot and kill you. Unsure if you're going to be involved in some kind of violent assault. Having your loved ones at home, worrying about those things day after day for 10, 20, 30 years, and what that would do to you, and how well you would accommodate that, and what a struggle it would be to continue to interact with people on, a intensely professional basis. And what I mean by an intensely professional basis, I mean in a climate where everything you do and everything you say, especially now, is being audio and video recorded, is going to be intensely scrutinized, is likely to end up in social media and go viral. I've had my wife call me on the way home because something I did an hour ago got out on social media and was making the rounds, and it was, again, a slice of a 2-hour interaction with somebody that got misrepresented in a particular way, and my wife was calling me asking me what the hell happened and why did you do what you do. My wife, right? And when I explained the entirety of the situation and then what followed after it and what was not captured by camera, she said, "Oh, really?" Right? I mean, it's tough, right? Cameras don't capture everything, but people are going to input their own biases and prejudices into whatever they see, filter it through those biases, their perception, and come to all sorts of crazy conclusions about what your internal thoughts and motivations were, what kind of person you are, and then what you should have done differently based on exactly zero training and experience. And there's no other career in the world where people feel so at liberty to speak with zero expertise and say, you should have done this or that. Imagine walking into the doctor's office. And there are people like that, don't get me wrong. But imagine walking to the doctor's office trying to tell them that, no, your years of medical school mean exactly nothing to me, and I know better than you. Or any other, controversial subject. People are so enamored with expertise and trust the science and listen to, this particular celebrity doctor and what their perspective is on whatever medical phenomena is going on right now. But God, when it comes to law enforcement, so everybody has suddenly gotten their, law degree on the internet. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. Let me know what you think. I like discussion. I like good-natured discussion. Like I've said before, that's difficult in the comment section. But if you have thoughts on this, I want to hear it, even if you disagree with me. But keep it civil. Anyway, see you on the next one.